The knocking on the door did not stop. It grew louder, harder, until the whole frame of the house seemed to shake with it. Baron Edgar Wentworth stood in his study, with a stack of unpaid letters in his hand, his face pale, his fingers trembling as he read the final line of the newest one. The bank had given him 1 week. Only 1 week before the estate, the land his family had held for 4 generations, would be taken from him forever. He had not slept in 3 nights. He had not eaten a full meal in 5. His wife, Lady Margaret, sat by the cold fireplace with her hands folded tightly in her lap, refusing to cry in front of the servants, though her eyes were red from doing exactly that the night before. Their world, once full of grand dinners and dancing and laughter that echoed down long hallways, had shrunk down to this single, freezing room, and to the sound of a debt collector's fist against their front door. Edgar set the letter down and walked to the window. Outside, a carriage he did not recognize was pulling up the long gravel drive. It was black, polished, pulled by 2 horses so well groomed that they alone looked worth more than everything left in the Wentworth household. He watched as a man stepped out, dressed in a coat cut from fine wool, his boots gleaming, even in the gray afternoon light. "Margaret," Edgar said quietly, "someone is here." She rose and joined him at the window, and together, they watched the stranger walk toward their door, with the calm, unhurried steps of a man who had never once in his life been afraid of anything. The butler, an old man named Alfred who had served the family since before either daughter was born, entered the study moments later, his face unreadable. "My lord," he said, "there is a gentleman here to see you. He says his business cannot wait." Edgar exchanged a look with his wife. He had no strength left for more bad news, but there was nothing to be done except face it. Send him in. The man who entered filled the doorway with quiet confidence. He was tall, with sharp gray eyes and dark hair beginning to gray at the edges, though his face was still young enough to suggest he was no older than 35. He wore no jewelry, no unnecessary decoration, yet everything about his clothing spoke of wealth so deep it did not need to announce itself. "Lord Wentworth," the man said, giving a short, polite bow. "My name is Reginald Hartwell. I believe you know of my family." Edgar's breath caught. Everyone in the county knew the name Hartwell. Reginald's late father had built one of the largest fortunes in the region through shipping and land, and Reginald, his only son, had inherited every coin of it. Rumors said he lived alone in a great house 3 days' ride from here, a man who had turned away every marriage offer sent to him for the past 10 years, a man some called cold, and others called simply careful. "Of course," Edgar said, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "To what do I owe this visit, Lord Hartwell?" Reginald did not sit, though a chair was offered. He stood near the fireplace, his hands folded behind his back, and studied the room for a long moment before speaking. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries, Lord Wentworth, because I do not believe you have the patience for them today," Reginald said. "I know about your debts. I know the bank has given you 7 days, and I have come here with an offer that could end all of it in a single afternoon." Edgar's heart pounded. Margaret gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. "I am prepared to pay every debt you owe," Reginald continued. "All of it. The bank, the merchants, the unpaid wages to your staff. I will settle every single account by tomorrow morning, if you agree to my condition." "What condition?" Edgar asked, though some part of him already feared the answer. "I have decided it is time for me to marry," Reginald said simply. "I have no interest in searching through ballrooms and garden parties for a bride. I find that process tiresome and dishonest. Everyone performs a version of themselves that is not real. I would rather make a direct arrangement." He paused. "You have daughters. I understand there are 3. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Edgar felt the room tilt slightly beneath him. "I will marry one of your daughters," Reginald said. "Whichever one you choose, I do not ask to meet them first. I do not ask for a courtship or a season of pretending. You choose, I marry her, and your family's debts disappear before the sun sets tomorrow." The silence that followed was heavier than anything Edgar had ever felt in his life. He looked at his wife, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, because both of them understood, in that instant, exactly what kind of choice they were being asked to make. "You are certain," Edgar finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You would marry whichever daughter I select, no conditions beyond that." "None," Reginald said. I am a man of my word, Lord Wentworth. Ask anyone who has done business with me. I do not make promises lightly, and I do not break the ones I make. Edgar thought of his eldest daughter, Constance, sharp-minded and ambitious, who had spent the last 2 years complaining bitterly about the family's fall from society. He thought of his middle daughter, Harriet, gentle and quiet, who spent her days painting and reading and rarely left her room. And he thought, briefly and without much weight, of his youngest daughter, Clara, who was somewhere out on the grounds at this very moment, likely covered in mud, tending to the horses that no one else in the family bothered with anymore. I accept, Edgar said, before he could stop himself. The words left his mouth like a stone dropped into still water, and he felt the ripples of them move through the room, through his wife's stunned expression, through his own chest where his heart had begun to race. Reginald nodded once, as though he had expected nothing less. Then let us not delay. Gather your daughters. I would like to make the arrangement official today. Margaret stepped forward, her voice trembling. Lord Hartwell, please, allow us at least a moment to prepare them. This is not a small thing you are asking. You have 1 hour, Reginald said, not unkindly, though there was no room for negotiation in his tone. I will wait in your drawing room. As Reginald left the study, Edgar sank into his chair, his hands shaking. Margaret rushed to him, but her mind was already elsewhere, already calculating, already deciding what needed to be done in the next 60 minutes to save the only home her family had ever known. News of the visitor spread through the house faster than fire through dry grass. By the time Constance heard what had happened, she was already standing in front of her mirror, pulling pins from her hair and starting again, determined to look perfect. She had heard the name Hartwell whispered in every parlor she had visited over the past year, always followed by the same words, richest man in the county, and impossible to catch. She was not going to let this chance slip away. Constance, her mother said, appearing in the doorway with an expression Constance had never seen on her before, somewhere between hope and horror. Your father has made an arrangement. Lord Hartwell has offered to pay off everything, every debt we owe, if he is permitted to marry one of you. Constance turned from the mirror, so quickly she nearly knocked over her chair. One of us? Which one? Your father has not chosen yet, Margaret said. But Constance, listen to me. This is not something to celebrate carelessly. This is a man none of us know. He is the wealthiest bachelor in 3 counties, Mother, Constance said, already reaching for her finest gown, a deep green silk she had been saving for an occasion exactly like this one. I do not need to know him well today. I only need to be chosen. She dressed with the speed and precision of a soldier preparing for battle, checking her reflection twice, 3 times, adjusting a curl here, smoothing a wrinkle there. She thought of her sister Harriet, who was likely still in her room, with paint on her fingers, uninterested in fine clothes or grand marriages. Harriet would not compete for this, and Clara, the youngest, was probably out with the horses as always, filthy and forgettable. Constance had little worry there either. No, Constance thought, as she walked toward the drawing room with her chin lifted high. This was hers to win, and she intended to win it. Out beyond the stables, far from the commotion inside the house, Clara Wentworth had no idea any of this was happening. She had been awake since before dawn, tending to Whisper, the family's oldest mare, who had grown weak over the winter and needed careful watching. Clara had spent hours brushing the horse's coat, checking her legs for swelling, coaxing her to eat a little more of her feed. It was quiet, honest work, the kind Clara preferred over the stiff conversations and empty smiles that filled her family's increasingly rare social gatherings. She did not hear the carriage arrive. She did not hear the servants whispering, or her mother's frantic footsteps through the halls, or her sister's excited laughter, as she prepared herself for a meeting that would decide the rest of her life. Clara was too far away, too absorbed in the simple, grounding rhythm of caring for an animal who needed her. It was only when the stable boy, a young man named William who had worked for the family since he was a child, came rushing out with wide eyes, that Clara realized something had happened. Miss Clara, he said, breathless, you need to come to the house. Right now, something important is happening, and I think it involves you as well. Me? Clara wiped her hands on her apron, confused. William? What are you talking about? I do not know all of it, he admitted. But there is a nobleman in the drawing room, a very wealthy one, and your father. He is deciding something about marriage, about one of the daughters. Everyone is already there. Everyone except you. Clara felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cold winter air. She looked down at herself, at the mud on her boots, the dirt under her fingernails, the loose strands of hair that had escaped from her braid throughout the morning. There was no time to change, no time to prepare, no time to do anything except run. She ran anyway. Inside the drawing room, the air was thick with tension. Reginald Hartwell stood near the window, his expression calm and unreadable, while Edgar and Margaret stood near the door, and Constance sat in the finest chair in the room, her posture perfect, her smile practiced and warm. Harriet had been brought down as well, though she stood near the back of the room, clearly uncomfortable, her hands stained faintly with the blue paint she had not fully washed off before being pulled from her studio. "I understand this is unusual," Reginald said, addressing the room, though his eyes moved between the two daughters present. "But I assure you, I do not intend to be cruel about this decision. I simply wish for it to be made quickly and honestly." Edgar cleared his throat. "My lord, may I present my eldest daughter, Constance?" Constance rose gracefully and extended her hand. "Lord Hartwell, it is truly an honor." Reginald took her hand briefly, his expression polite but distant, the same expression he might have given a business associate at a formal dinner. "Miss Wentworth, and my daughter Harriet," Edgar continued, gesturing toward the quieter girl near the back of the room. Harriet gave a small, nervous curtsy. "My lord." Reginald nodded to her as well, though his gaze did not linger. Something in the room felt unfinished to him, though he could not have said what. He glanced toward the door, almost without meaning to, as though some part of him expected someone else to walk through it. "You have one more daughter, I believe," Reginald said, turning back to Edgar. "Is she not present?" Before Edgar could answer, the door to the drawing room burst open, with a force that startled everyone inside. Clara stood in the doorway, chest heaving from her run across the grounds, her boots caked in mud, her hair falling loose around her flushed face, a streak of dirt across one cheek, where she had wiped her hand without thinking. She looked nothing like the composed, elegant image of a young noblewoman that the room had been arranged to present. "I am so sorry," Clara said, still catching her breath. "I was with the horses. No one told me until just now." The room fell into stunned silence. Constance's face twisted with embarrassment on her sister's behalf, and perhaps a flicker of something else, something closer to satisfaction, as though Clara's disheveled appearance only made her own polished presentation shine brighter by comparison. But Reginald Hartwell was not looking at Constance anymore. He was looking at the girl in the doorway, mud on her boots and dirt on her cheek, and her chest still rising and falling from the effort of running the entire distance from the stables, the moment she had learned something important was happening without her. There was no performance in her expression, no practiced smile, only surprise and irritation at having been caught unprepared, and a kind of raw honesty that Reginald had not encountered in years of formal introductions and carefully rehearsed conversations. "And you are?" he asked, his voice quieter than it had been all afternoon. "Clara," she said, straightening slightly, suddenly aware that every eye in the room was on her. "Clara Wentworth." "The youngest," Edgar added quickly, stepping forward as though to shield his daughter from further scrutiny, or perhaps to shield the arrangement from her unpolished arrival. "My lord, please forgive her appearance. She was attending to the horses, and was not informed in time to prepare herself properly." "There is nothing to forgive," Reginald said, and something in his tone made Edgar pause. "I did not ask for preparation. I asked for a choice among your daughters, and it seems I now have all three in front of me." Clara's eyes widened as the meaning of the room finally settled over her. She looked at her father, then at her mother, then at Constance, whose smile had grown thin and tight, and finally back at the stranger by the window who was watching her with an intensity that made her stomach twist with unease. "Wait," Clara said slowly. "This is about marriage? Someone is choosing a wife right now, in this room?" "Clara," her mother said softly, a warning and a plea wrapped into a single word. "I do not understand," Clara continued, her voice rising slightly. "You are asking my father to choose which of us marries a man none of us have ever met, as though we were livestock being sold at market?" The room tensed further. Constance shot her sister a furious look, mortified at the bluntness of her words in front of a man whose approval she desperately wanted. But Reginald did not seem offended. If anything, the corner of his mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly, into something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "That is, essentially, an accurate description of the arrangement, Miss Wentworth," he said. "Though I would not have phrased it quite so directly myself." "Then I refuse," Clara said, before she could stop herself, before she could think through the weight of what she was saying, in front of a man whose fortune could save her entire family. "I do not know you, my lord. I do not know anything about you beyond your name and your wealth, and I will not agree to spend the rest of my life bound to a stranger, simply because my father has debts to pay." "Clara!" Edgar's voice cracked with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You do not understand what is at stake here." "I understand perfectly," Clara said, though her voice trembled now, the bravery of her outburst beginning to waver under the weight of her father's stare. "You would sell one of us to save the house. I simply refuse to be the one who is sold." She turned and walked out of the room before anyone could stop her, her muddy boots leaving faint marks on the polished floor behind her, the door closing with a soft, final click that echoed louder in the silence than any slammed door could have. For a long moment, no one in the drawing room spoke. Constance was the first to break the silence, forcing her voice into something light and apologetic, though her eyes betrayed the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Please forgive my sister, my lord. She has always had a temper when it comes to matters she does not fully understand. I assure you, I am more than prepared to honor this arrangement, whatever form it may take." Reginald did not respond right away. He was still looking at the closed door, an expression on his face that no one in the room, not even Edgar, who had known him for less than an hour, could quite read. "I appreciate your willingness, Miss Wentworth," he finally said, turning back to Constance with the same polite, distant expression he had worn since arriving. "But I made a promise to your father. I said I would marry whichever daughter he chose, without conditions. I did not say the daughter herself had no voice in the matter." Edgar's face went pale. "My lord, please, if you would simply allow me to speak with her, to make her understand the importance of—" "There is no need to force anything today," Reginald said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "I am a patient man, Lord Wentworth. I have waited many years to consider marriage at all. I can wait a little longer to see how this particular matter resolves itself." He turned toward the window once more, looking out at the winter grounds beyond the glass, and somewhere in the distance, past the frost-covered gardens, he could just make out the small figure of Clara Wentworth walking quickly back toward the stables, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, her head down, her steps determined despite the chaos she had just left behind her. "I will call again tomorrow," Reginald said, more to himself than to the room. "And we will see, then, what has changed." He left without another word, climbing back into his black carriage, as the family watched from the windows, none of them certain whether they had just witnessed the salvation of their household or the beginning of something far more complicated than any of them had imagined that morning. The carriage pulled away down the long gravel drive, disappearing around the bend where the frost-covered trees stood like silent witnesses, and behind them, in the house that still owed more money than it could ever hope to repay, the Wentworth family stood frozen, each of them wondering what the next day would bring. By the next morning, the house had changed. It was not louder, exactly, but the silence inside it had a different quality, tense and watchful, like the stillness before a storm breaks over open water. Clara woke before sunrise, as she always did, and for a moment, lying in the gray light of her small room, she almost believed the events of the previous day had been nothing more than a strange dream brought on by exhaustion. Then she remembered the look on her father's face when she had refused, and she knew it had been real. She dressed quickly and made her way down to the kitchen, hoping to slip out to the stables before anyone else in the house was awake. She was not so lucky. Her mother was already there, sitting at the long wooden table with a cup of tea gone cold in front of her, her eyes rimmed red from another night without sleep. "Clara," Margaret said, her voice careful, the way one might speak to someone standing too close to the edge of something dangerous. "Sit with me for a moment." Clara hesitated at the doorway, then sat, folding her hands in her lap the way she had been taught as a child, though the gesture felt foreign to her now, stiff and performed. "I am not going to change my mind," Clara said, before her mother could speak. "I know that is why you are sitting here." "I only want to understand," Margaret said. "You have always been the most sensible of my daughters, Clara." Even as a child, you thought carefully before you acted. I do not understand why, on a matter as important as this, you refused before you had even taken a moment to consider it. Because I did consider it, Clara said. I considered it the entire walk back to the stables yesterday. I considered how a man I have never spoken to, never so much as shared a single conversation with, decided within the space of an afternoon that he was prepared to marry whichever of us father selected, as though we were parcels of land to be traded for a debt. I considered how none of you seemed troubled by that. I considered how Constance looked as though she might faint from joy at the thought of it. Margaret flinched slightly, but did not argue the point. Your father is dying inside from worry, Clara. I do not say that to frighten you. I say it because it is true. He has not slept properly in weeks. The debt collectors have already come to the door twice this month. If nothing changes, we will lose this house before the spring. We will lose everything your family has built for 4 generations, and your father, your sisters, all of us, will have nowhere left to go. Clara's throat tightened. She had known the family's finances were poor, but she had not understood, until this moment, how close to complete ruin they truly stood. Then let Constance marry him, Clara said quietly. She wants it. She has wanted a marriage like this for years. Why does it need to be me? Because, Margaret said, her voice dropping even lower, he did not ask for Constance. The words settled over the kitchen like a heavy blanket. Clara sat very still, processing what her mother had just told her. What do you mean? I mean that when he left yesterday, he told your father he would return today to see how matters had settled, Margaret said. But before he climbed into his carriage, he said something else. He said he intended to speak with you directly. Clara felt her stomach drop. Why would he want to speak with me? I refused him in front of the entire room. I do not know, Clara, Margaret admitted, but your father believes, and I confess I am beginning to believe it as well, that Lord Hartwell has already made his choice, and it was not your sister. Clara stood so abruptly that her chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. That is not possible. He spoke perhaps 3 sentences to me. He does not know the first thing about me. Perhaps that is precisely why he wants to, Margaret said. Clara did not answer. She turned and left the kitchen, walking quickly through the cold morning air toward the stables, seeking the one place in the entire estate where the world still made sense to her, where the animals did not care about debts or marriages or the shape of a man's fortune, only about food and warmth and a gentle hand. William was already there when she arrived, mucking out one of the stalls, and he looked up when she entered, immediately noticing the tightness in her expression. Rough morning? He asked. You have no idea, Clara said, grabbing a brush and moving toward Whisper's stall, needing the familiar motion of caring for the old mare, to steady her racing thoughts. Is it true then? William asked carefully. What everyone in the kitchen is saying? That the nobleman wants to marry you? Clara's hand paused mid-stroke against the horse's flank. The staff are already talking about it? Miss Clara, half the county will be talking about it by supper, William said, not unkindly. A man like Lord Hartwell does not visit a house like this without every servant for 10 miles hearing of it within a day. Clara let out a long breath and rested her forehead against Whisper's warm neck for a moment, drawing comfort from the horse's steady breathing. I do not want this, William. I did not ask for any of it. I only wanted to take care of the horses and live quietly, away from all the noise my sister seems to crave so desperately. William was quiet for a moment, continuing his work, though his eyes occasionally drifted toward her. He had known Clara since they were both children, back when the estate had still been prosperous, back when Clara used to sneak out to the stables not out of necessity, but out of pure joy, simply to be near the animals she loved. He had watched her grow from a curious girl into a capable young woman who understood these creatures better than most grown men who had spent their entire lives working with horses. For what it is worth, William finally said, I do not think a man like that deserves someone like you. Not because you are not worthy of him, because I do not believe he is worthy of you. Clara looked up, surprised by the quiet intensity in his voice. You have never even met him. I do not need to, William said. I have heard enough about men like him. Wealthy, powerful, accustomed to getting whatever they decide they want, the moment they decide they want it. A man like that does not know the value of someone who wakes before dawn to care for a sick horse, simply because it is the right thing to do, not because anyone is watching or rewarding her for it. Clara did not respond right away. Something in William's words, in the careful way he avoided looking directly at her as he said them, made her feel oddly exposed, as though he had revealed something about himself that he had not intended to share. She pushed the thought aside, telling herself it was simply the strange tension of the day making her imagine things that were not there. The morning passed in a blur of chores and half-finished thoughts. Clara worked harder than usual, throwing herself into every task as though sheer physical effort could somehow delay the moment she knew was coming. But delay it she could not. Just past midday, the same black carriage from the day before appeared once again at the top of the long gravel drive, and this time, Clara watched it approach from the stable window, with a feeling of dread pooling low in her stomach. She considered running. She genuinely considered saddling one of the horses and riding out across the fields, far enough that no carriage could follow, far enough that she would not have to face whatever conversation was about to unfold. But she knew, even as the thought crossed her mind, that it would solve nothing. It would only delay the inevitable and leave her family to bear the weight of her absence. So instead, she wiped her hands on her apron, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the house to meet whatever was waiting for her there. Inside, the household had once again gathered in anticipation, though this time, the mood was different. Constance paced near the window of the drawing room, her earlier confidence replaced by a simmering, barely restrained frustration. She had spent the entire previous evening convincing herself that Clara's outburst had been nothing more than a temporary embarrassment, easily forgotten, and that today, Lord Hartwell would surely return his attention to her, the daughter who was actually prepared to be a proper wife. But when Reginald entered the drawing room and immediately asked, before even offering a greeting to Edgar, whether he might speak with Clara alone, Constance felt something cold settle in her chest. "Alone?" Edgar repeated, glancing nervously at his wife. "My lord, I am not certain that is entirely proper." "I assure you, Lord Wentworth, my intentions are honorable," Reginald said. "I simply believe your daughter deserves the chance to speak her mind without an audience watching her every word. Yesterday, she was cornered in a room full of witnesses and asked to accept a proposal she had no time to consider. I would like to offer her a fairer conversation today." Edgar looked as though he wanted to argue, but the desperation of his circumstances won out over his hesitation. "Very well. I will have her brought to the garden. It is private enough, and still within sight of the house." Constance's fingers curled into tight fists at her sides, as she watched Reginald follow a servant out toward the garden, leaving her standing alone in the drawing room, with nothing but her own simmering resentment for company. She had done everything right. She had dressed perfectly, spoken perfectly, presented herself exactly as a wife of a wealthy nobleman should be presented, and still, somehow, it was Clara, muddy, disheveled, ungrateful Clara, who had captured his attention. She would not allow it to remain that way, not without a fight. Out in the garden, beneath the bare branches of winter trees, Clara waited with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching Reginald approach along the frost-covered path. He walked slowly, unhurried, and when he reached her, he stopped at a respectful distance, close enough to speak comfortably, but far enough that she did not feel crowded. "Miss Wentworth," he said, "thank you for agreeing to see me." "I was not given much choice in the matter," Clara said, though her tone was less sharp than it had been the day before. Reginald allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. "No, I suppose you were not." "That seems to be a recurring theme in our brief acquaintance so far. I apologize for that. It was not my intention to make you feel cornered." "And yet here we are," Clara said. "Cornered in a garden instead of a drawing room." "Fair enough," Reginald admitted. "Would you prefer I leave you in peace?" Clara studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the arrogance she had expected to find there, the same casual entitlement she had seen in every wealthy man who had ever passed through her family's social circles. But she did not find it. Instead, she found something quieter, more careful, an expression that reminded her, oddly, of the way she herself approached a nervous horse, patient and unhurried, unwilling to force trust where none yet existed. "No," she said finally, surprising herself. "You may speak. But I want to be clear that nothing you say is likely to change my answer. I would expect nothing less from someone who spoke her mind so plainly in front of an entire room of strangers yesterday," Reginald said. "It was, if I am honest, the most interesting moment I have experienced in years of these sorts of arrangements." "You find my refusal interesting?" I find your honesty interesting, he corrected. Miss Wentworth, I have spent the better part of a decade being pursued by young women who tell me exactly what they believe I wish to hear. I have grown so accustomed to it that I have nearly forgotten what genuine conversation sounds like. Yesterday, in the span of perhaps 30 seconds, you told me precisely what you thought of me, of the arrangement, and of the entire situation, without a single moment of hesitation or performance. I have not encountered that in a very long time. Clara felt a flicker of something she could not quite name, somewhere between confusion and reluctant curiosity. That does not mean I have changed my mind about the arrangement itself. I am not asking you to, Reginald said. I did not come here today to convince you to marry me, Miss Wentworth. I came here to correct a misunderstanding. You believe I see you and your sisters as objects to be traded, parcels of land exchanged to settle a debt. I understand why you believe that, given the circumstances under which the offer was made. But I would like the chance to explain myself, if you are willing to listen. Clara said nothing, but she did not walk away either, and Reginald took that as permission enough to continue. I did not make this offer to your father because I wished to acquire a wife the way one acquires property, he said. I made it because I am tired, Miss Wentworth. Tired of a world where every interaction is a performance, where every young woman I meet has been coached by her mother on precisely which words will win my favor, where every smile directed at me is calculated for effect rather than felt honestly. I proposed a direct arrangement because at least a direct arrangement would be honest about what it was. There would be no pretense of romance where none existed, no false courtship designed to disguise a transaction that everyone in the room already understood was happening anyway. That is a very bleak way to view marriage, Clara said quietly. Perhaps, Reginald admitted, but it is the only version of it I have ever witnessed among people of my standing. My own parents' marriage was arranged in much the same manner, and though they came to care for one another in their own quiet way over the years, I do not believe either of them would describe it as anything resembling the romantic ideals your generation seems to favor. Clara considered this for a long moment, the cold winter air biting at her cheeks, her breath forming small clouds in front of her face. And what happened yesterday, when you saw me arrive covered in mud, when you decided you wished to speak with me instead of my sister, who had prepared herself specifically to win your approval? What was that, if not exactly the kind of performance you claim to despise? Reginald was quiet for a moment, and for the first time since she had met him, Clara saw something shift in his expression. Something almost like vulnerability, quickly hidden away again beneath his usual composure. That, he said slowly, was the opposite of performance, Miss Wentworth. That was the first time in longer than I care to admit that I saw someone simply be exactly what they were, without any attempt to shape themselves into what they believed I wanted to see. You were annoyed. You were unprepared. You said so plainly, and you did not apologize for it beyond the basic courtesy of explaining your absence. I found that, quite unexpectedly, far more compelling than anything your sister said or did in that room. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold, and she looked away, uncertain how to respond to words that felt uncomfortably sincere. I still refuse, she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. I understand, Reginald said, and I will not push you further today, but I would like to ask one thing of you, if you are willing to grant it. What is that? Allow me to return, from time to time, simply to speak with you, not as a suitor pressing his case, but as two people becoming acquainted, without any expectation attached to it. If, after some time, you still wish to refuse the arrangement entirely, I will honor that. I will still settle your father's debts, regardless of your final answer. I made a promise to him, and I do not intend to use your decision as leverage against a family already suffering enough. Clara stared at him, searching his face once more for any hint of deception, any sign that this was simply a more patient version of the same manipulation, but she found none. You would forgive the debt even if I never agree to marry you? She asked. Yes, Reginald said simply. Why would you do that? What benefit is there for you in helping a family that owes you nothing? Reginald considered the question carefully before answering. Perhaps because I am tired of transactions, Miss Wentworth, even the ones I proposed myself. Perhaps I would simply like the chance to know you as a person, without the weight of debt and obligation hanging over every conversation between us. What you choose to do with that chance, is entirely your own decision." Clara did not answer right away. The wind moved through the bare branches above them, scattering the last of the frost from the leaves that still clung stubbornly to a few low-hanging limbs, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear Whisper's soft, familiar whinny drifting from the stables, a sound as comforting to her as any voice she had ever known. "I will not promise anything," she finally said, "but you may return, if you wish, on the condition that you never again ask my father to force my hand in this." "You have my word," Reginald said, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice made Clara believe him, despite every instinct that told her she should not. He left shortly after, without pressing further, without attempting to extend the conversation beyond what she had agreed to. Clara stood alone in the garden for a long while after his carriage disappeared down the drive, turning his words over in her mind again and again, unable to decide whether she had just made a grave mistake or the first honest decision anyone in her family had made in years. Inside the house, Constance watched from an upstairs window as the black carriage rolled away, her expression hardening into something far less pleasant than the polished smile she had worn for the entirety of the previous day. Whatever had happened in that garden, she did not need to hear the details to understand its meaning. Lord Hartwell had chosen his path, and it did not lead to her. She would not accept that easily. Not after everything she had sacrificed, every ambition she had nurtured, every year she had spent preparing herself precisely for a chance like this one. If Clara would not step aside willingly, Constance decided, standing rigid at the window with her jaw set tight, then she would simply have to be removed from the path another way. 3 days passed before Reginald returned again, and in that time, the house fell into an uneasy rhythm that felt to Clara like walking across ice she was not entirely certain would hold her weight. Her father had grown quieter, watching her at meals with an expression of cautious hope that made her stomach twist with guilt, as though her hesitation alone might be the difference between the family keeping their home or losing it entirely. Her mother spoke to her more gently than she had in years, careful and measured, the way one might speak to someone recovering from an illness. And Constance had grown colder. It was a subtle shift at first, small enough that Clara almost convinced herself she was imagining it. A comment here, sharper than it needed to be. A silence there, held a beat too long, but by the second day, the coldness had become impossible to ignore. Constance no longer joined Clara for the small rituals that had once, however rarely, brought the sisters together. The shared cup of tea in the late afternoon, the quiet exchange of gossip about the staff or the neighbors. Instead, Constance kept to her room for long stretches, and when she did emerge, her eyes followed Clara with a watchfulness that felt less like sisterly concern and more like calculation. Clara tried not to dwell on it. She had enough weighing on her mind already, between the ache of her father's unspoken hope and the strange, unsettled feeling that had lodged itself in her chest since her conversation with Reginald in the garden. She found herself, against her own better judgment, thinking about their exchange more often than she cared to admit, replaying the careful way he had spoken, the surprising honesty in his answers, the way he had looked at her, as though she were the first real thing he had encountered in years. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself it changed nothing. She was not entirely certain she believed it. On the morning of the third day, Clara woke earlier than usual, unable to sleep further, and made her way down to the stables long before the sun had fully risen over the frost-covered hills. Whisper greeted her with a soft nicker, and Clara pressed her forehead against the mare's warm neck, drawing in the familiar, grounding scent of hay and horse and cold morning air. "I do not know what I am doing," she admitted quietly to the horse, who could offer no answer beyond a gentle shift of her weight and a soft huff of breath against Clara's shoulder. "Everyone expects something different from me, and I cannot seem to decide what I expect from myself." She was still standing there, lost in thought, when William entered the stable carrying a bucket of feed, his breath visible in the cold morning air. He paused when he saw her, something unreadable flickering across his face before he schooled it back into its usual careful neutrality. "You are up early," he said. "I could not sleep," Clara admitted. William set the bucket down and began distributing feed to the other stalls, his movements efficient and practiced from years of repetition. "Is it because of him, the nobleman?" Clara hesitated before answering. "Partly. He returns again today, I believe." "And what will you say to him this time?" "I do not know," Clara admitted, more honestly than she had intended. He asked only for the chance to know me, William. Not for a promise of marriage. Just conversation. I told him he could return under that condition. William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though his hands did not pause in their work. And do you believe that is all he wants? Simply conversation? I believe he was sincere when he said it, Clara said. Whether that remains true forever, I cannot say. But he has not pressed me further than that, not once. He is a patient man, then, William said, an edge creeping into his voice that Clara had rarely heard from him before. Patient men are often the most dangerous kind. They do not force what they want, they simply wait until the person in front of them grows comfortable enough to hand it over willingly. Clara turned to look at him fully, surprised by the intensity behind his words. You sound as though you know him personally. I do not need to know him personally to understand men of his kind, William said, his voice quieter now, though no less firm. I have spent my whole life watching wealthy men take whatever they decide they want, simply because the world has taught them they are entitled to it. I do not say this to frighten you, Clara. I say it because I care what happens to you, more than perhaps I have any right to. The words hung in the cold morning air between them, heavier than either of them had perhaps intended. Clara felt her cheeks warm despite the chill, uncertain how to respond to the unexpected weight of his admission. William, she began carefully, You do not need to say anything, he interrupted gently, already turning back to his work, his shoulders squared as though bracing himself against whatever response she might have offered. I only wanted you to know it, in case it matters, when you are deciding what to do about all of this. Clara stood in silence for a long moment, watching him work, a new and uncomfortable tangle of feelings settling in her chest, alongside everything else already weighing on her. She had known William for most of her life. He had always been steady, dependable, a quiet presence in the background of her days spent among the horses. She had never once considered that his steadiness might have been rooted in something deeper than simple friendship. She did not have time to untangle the thought further. Before she could speak again, the sound of raised voices drifted from the direction of the main house, sharp and urgent enough to carry all the way to the stables. Clara exchanged a worried glance with William before hurrying out into the cold morning light, following the sound toward whatever new crisis had descended upon her family. She found the source of the commotion at the front steps of the house, where two men in plain, official-looking coats stood facing her father, papers clutched in their hands, their expressions cold and businesslike. Edgar stood before them, his face ashen, his hands trembling at his sides. Please, he was saying, his voice cracking with desperation. I have made arrangements. The debt will be settled within days, I assure you, if you would only grant a small extension. We have already granted extensions, Lord Wentworth, one of the men said, his tone flat and unmoved. The bank's patience has run out. We are here to inform you formally that if the debt is not settled in full by the end of this week, the property will be seized and sold to recover the losses. End of this week, Edgar repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Those are the terms, the man said. I am sorry, my lord, truly. But the decision is not mine to make. Clara watched from the edge of the drive, her heart pounding, as the two men climbed back into their carriage and departed, leaving her father standing alone on the front steps, his shoulders slumped in a way that made him look, for the first time in Clara's memory, genuinely old. Margaret rushed out from the house to steady him, and together they made their way back inside, neither of them noticing Clara standing frozen near the stable path, watching the entire scene unfold with a growing sense of dread. Only a handful of days remained before her family lost everything. She thought of Reginald's promise, made so casually in the quiet of the garden, that he would settle the debt regardless of her final decision. She had believed him then, she still believed him now, but belief alone did not erase the crushing weight of watching her father crumble in real time, did not undo the years of strain that had brought them to this exact, desperate point. When Reginald's carriage arrived later that afternoon, right on schedule as he had promised, Clara was waiting for him near the front steps, before he had even fully descended from the vehicle, her earlier hesitation replaced by something more urgent. You said you would settle my father's debts regardless of my answer, she said, before he had a chance to offer even a simple greeting. Did you mean that? Reginald's expression shifted immediately, sensing the urgency in her voice. Of course. What has happened? Men came from the bank this morning, Clara said, her composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of everything she had been holding together for days. "They said if the debt is not paid by the end of this week, they will take the house." Everything. My father looked as though he had aged a decade in the span of a single conversation. Reginald's jaw tightened, a flash of something sharp and decisive crossing his features. "Take me to your father." They found Edgar in his study once more, exactly where Clara had first learned of Reginald's original offer, though this time, the man behind the desk looked nothing like the composed nobleman who had made such a confident bargain days earlier. Edgar sat slumped in his chair, staring at nothing, the pile of unpaid letters scattered across his desk like fallen leaves. "Lord Wentworth," Reginald said, and Edgar startled slightly, looking up as though pulled from a great distance. "My lord," Edgar said, straightening with visible effort, "forgive me, I did not hear you enter." "Your daughter tells me the bank has given a final deadline," Reginald said. "The end of this week." Edgar nodded miserably. "I do not know what else to do. I have tried every avenue available to me, and none of them have yielded enough to save us." "Then allow me to end this uncertainty today," Reginald said, moving toward the desk and retrieving a sheet of paper from within his own coat, one he had clearly brought prepared for precisely this possibility. "This is a bank draft, sufficient to cover the full amount owed, plus additional funds to settle any remaining debts to your merchants and staff. I will have my own solicitor deliver it to the bank myself this evening, so there can be no further delay or confusion." Edgar stared at the paper as though it might disappear if he looked away from it for even a moment. "My lord, I do not understand. My daughter has not yet agreed to anything. You said this offer was contingent on—" "I said no such thing to your daughter," Reginald corrected gently. "I told her the arrangement would proceed regardless of her final decision. I do not intend to go back on that promise, simply because circumstances have grown more urgent. Your family's survival should not be held hostage to a decision that deserves to be made freely, without the pressure of imminent ruin hanging over it." Edgar's hands shook as he finally reached out and took the paper, tears welling in his eyes as the full weight of relief crashed over him. "I do not know how to thank you, my lord. You have saved us. You have truly saved us, and asked for nothing in return." "I have asked for nothing beyond honesty," Reginald said quietly, his gaze shifting briefly toward Clara, who stood near the doorway watching the exchange with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something warmer, something she had not expected to feel toward this man who, only days earlier, she had refused so completely. That evening, after Reginald had departed to make good on his promise to the bank, the house filled with a kind of relief so profound it felt almost unfamiliar, as though the family had forgotten what it meant to breathe without the weight of impending ruin pressing down upon them. Margaret wept openly at the dinner table, clutching her husband's hand across the polished wood. Edgar looked 10 years younger than he had that morning, some of the color returning to his face for the first time in weeks. Only Constance remained visibly unmoved by the celebration, picking at her food in silence, her eyes occasionally flicking toward Clara, with an expression that was difficult to read, but impossible to mistake as anything resembling joy. Later that night, long after the rest of the household had retired, Clara found herself unable to sleep, her mind too full of everything that had happened over the course of the day. She rose from her bed and made her way quietly through the darkened halls, intending to slip out to the stables for a few moments of solitude among the familiar comfort of the horses. But as she passed by Constance's door, she paused, catching the faint sound of her sister's voice from within, low and urgent, as though speaking to someone else in the room. Clara knew she should not listen. She knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever conversation was happening behind that closed door was not meant for her ears. But something in the tension of her sister's tone rooted her in place, and before she could talk herself out of it, she leaned closer, straining to make out the words. "Cannot simply let this happen," Constance was saying, her voice tight with barely restrained frustration. "Everything I have worked for, everything I have sacrificed, and she simply walks in late, covered in filth, and somehow, that is enough to undo it all." A second voice answered, male, unfamiliar to Clara, low enough that she could not make out the words clearly, though the tone carried a note of reassurance, of quiet agreement with whatever plan was being discussed. Clara's heart pounded. She did not recognize the voice, and the realization that her sister was meeting secretly with someone, at this hour, discussing what could only be some scheme related to the current situation, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold night air seeping through the drafty hallway. She backed away from the door as quietly as she could manage, her mind racing, uncertain whether to confront her sister directly or to simply watch and wait, gathering whatever information she could before deciding how best to protect herself and her family from whatever Constance was planning. Whatever it was, Clara understood, with a growing sense of dread. Her sister had no intention of accepting defeat quietly. Clara did not sleep that night. She lay awake for hours, staring at the shadows cast across her ceiling by the pale winter moonlight, turning the mysterious voice over and over in her mind, trying to place it among the handful of men who occasionally visited the estate. She could not. It belonged to no one she recognized, no family friend, no neighbor, no merchant who called upon her father regarding business. Whoever it was, Constance had chosen to meet with him in secret, late at night, discussing plans she clearly did not wish anyone else in the household to overhear. By morning, Clara had decided she would say nothing, not yet. She had no proof of wrongdoing, only a fragment of overheard conversation and a growing sense of unease that she could not fully justify with facts alone. She resolved instead to watch carefully, to pay closer attention to her sister's movements, and to trust her instincts if anything further seemed amiss. She did not have to wait long. 2 days later, a letter arrived at the estate, addressed to Reginald Hartwell, though it was delivered by mistake to the Wentworth household first, the courier having confused the similar-sounding names of 2 neighboring properties. Clara happened to be the one who answered the door when the confused delivery boy arrived, and she nearly handed the letter back immediately upon realizing the error, until something about the handwriting on the envelope caught her attention. It was Constance's handwriting, unmistakably so. Clara had grown up watching her sister practice her penmanship for hours as a child, perfecting the elegant, sloping style that Constance had always been so proud of. There was no mistaking it now, not even disguised beneath a slightly more formal flourish than usual. Clara knew she should not open a letter addressed to someone else. She knew, with absolute certainty, that doing so crossed a line she had never before considered crossing. But the events of the past several days, the overheard conversation, the strange voice, her sister's simmering resentment, all of it combined into a weight of suspicion heavy enough to override her better judgment. She opened the letter. The words inside made her blood run cold. "My Lord Hartwell," the letter began, in Constance's careful, practiced script, "I feel it is my duty, out of concern for your well-being and reputation, to share certain information regarding my sister Clara that I believe you deserve to know before proceeding any further with your intentions toward her." Clara's hands trembled as she continued reading. The letter went on to describe, in careful, damaging detail, a fabricated account of Clara's supposed attachment to the stable hand William, painting the relationship in terms far more scandalous than the truth could ever support, suggesting an impropriety that had never occurred, framing Clara as dishonest and unworthy of a nobleman's attention. The letter closed with an offer, thinly veiled beneath a tone of concerned honesty, suggesting that Constance herself would make a far more suitable and loyal match, one untainted by any such complications. Clara stood frozen in the entryway, the letter shaking in her hands, a mixture of fury and heartbreak rising within her so quickly she could barely draw a full breath. Her own sister, the person she had grown up beside, shared meals with, celebrated small joys and mourned small sorrows alongside for her entire life, had written lies about her, deliberate and cruel, all in an attempt to secure a marriage for herself. She thought of the voice she had overheard through Constance's door. Not a suitor helping Constance's scheme, she realized now, but perhaps simply a messenger, paid or persuaded to help deliver whatever plan her sister had devised. Clara folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her dress, her mind racing. She could confront Constance directly, demand an explanation, force her sister to admit what she had done, but some instinct told her that direct confrontation would only lead to denial, to further lies, to a battle of words that would ultimately settle nothing. She needed proof that could not be argued away, and she needed, more than anything, to ensure the letter never reached Reginald's hands in its original, damaging form. She spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet turmoil, going through her usual chores at the stables, with only half her attention on the animals in front of her. William noticed her distraction almost immediately, though when he asked what troubled her, She found herself unable to explain the full truth. Not yet. Not until she understood better how to handle the situation herself. "You seem far away today," William observed, watching her absently brush the same section of Whisper's coat for the third time in a row. "I have a great deal on my mind," Clara admitted, setting the brush aside with a sigh. "William, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." He straightened, his expression growing serious at the shift in her tone. "Of course. Has anyone approached you recently, asking questions about our friendship? About the time we spent together here in the stables?" William's brow furrowed in confusion. "No, no one has said anything to me. Why do you ask?" Clara studied his face carefully, searching for any hint of deception, but found none, only genuine bewilderment. Whatever Constance's plan involved, it seemed William himself had no knowledge of being used as a piece within it. "It does not matter," Clara said, though her tone made clear that it did in fact matter a great deal. "I will explain when I better understand it myself." That evening, Reginald arrived for his scheduled visit, unaware of the letter that had nearly found its way into his hands hours earlier. He found Clara waiting for him in the garden once more, though her expression carried a weight and seriousness that had not been present during their previous conversations. "You seem troubled," he observed, studying her carefully as he approached. "Has something happened?" Clara hesitated, weighing whether to tell him the truth or to simply let the matter pass quietly, unaddressed. But she thought of the letter's cruel, calculated words, of the damage it might have done had it reached him unaltered, and she decided, in that moment, that honesty was the only path she was willing to walk, regardless of the consequences it might bring within her own family. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the folded letter, holding it out to him without a word. Reginald took it, his brow furrowing as he unfolded the paper and began to read. Clara watched his expression shift as he made his way through the fabricated accusations, his jaw tightening, a coldness settling over his features that she had not seen from him before. "This was addressed to me," he said quietly, once he had finished reading. "It was delivered here by mistake," Clara explained. "I recognized my sister's handwriting and opened it before I fully considered whether I should. I know that was not my right to do, but I could not, in good conscience, allow it to reach you without you first understanding the truth of what it contains."
"And the truth is?"
Reginald asked, his gaze steady on her face. "None of it is real," Clara said firmly. "William is a friend, someone I have known my entire life, someone who helps me care for the horses. There has never been any impropriety between us, nothing that could remotely justify what my sister has written here." Reginald was quiet for a long moment, refolding the letter carefully before tucking it into his own coat. "I believe you," he said finally, "not simply because you have told me so, though I do believe your word carries weight. I believe you because the tone of this letter reveals far more about the person who wrote it than it does about you." Clara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "I did not want to believe my own sister capable of something like this. We have never been close in the way some sisters are, but I never imagined she would resort to outright falsehood simply to secure an advantage." "Desperation reveals a great deal about a person's character," Reginald said. "Sometimes it reveals strength no one expected. Sometimes it reveals something far less admirable. It seems your sister has chosen the latter path, unfortunately." "What will you do?" Clara asked, uncertain whether Reginald intended to confront Constance directly, or to simply let the matter quietly pass, now that the truth had been revealed. "I will do nothing, for now," Reginald said. "I have no interest in causing further discord within your family, particularly when your father has only just begun to recover from the weight of his previous troubles. But I will remember this, Miss Wentworth. I will remember exactly what your sister was willing to do, and to whom, in pursuit of a goal she believed herself entitled to." Clara nodded slowly, though a lingering unease remained in her chest. She thought of Constance's face at the dinner table 2 nights earlier, tight and unmoved amid the family's celebration, and wondered, with a growing sense of dread, what other schemes her sister might already be preparing, should this first attempt fail to achieve its intended effect. She did not have long to wonder. The very next morning, before Clara had even finished her breakfast, Constance appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, her face pale, her eyes wide with an emotion Clara had never before seen from her sister directed toward herself, genuine fear. "Clara," Constance said, her voice trembling in a way that immediately set Clara on edge. I need to speak with you, alone, right now. Clara set down her spoon slowly, studying her sister's face, searching for any sign of the calculating coldness that had defined their recent interactions. She found none. Only fear, raw and unguarded, the kind that could not easily be manufactured for effect. "What is it?" Clara asked, rising from her seat. Constance glanced nervously toward the kitchen door, as though worried someone might overhear, before stepping closer and lowering her voice to little more than a whisper. "The letter I wrote," she said. "The one meant for Lord Hartwell. I need to know if you have read it, and I need you to understand something, before it is too late for either of us." Clara led her sister to the small sitting room at the back of the house, a rarely used space that offered enough privacy for whatever conversation Constance seemed desperate to have. Once the door was closed, Constance sank into a chair, her hands twisting anxiously in her lap, all traces of her usual composed elegance stripped away. "Yes," Clara said, taking a seat across from her. "I read the letter, and I gave it to Lord Hartwell myself, so he would understand the truth before any lies could take root." Constance's face crumpled, though whether from shame or fear, Clara could not immediately tell. "Then he knows. He knows what I wrote." "He knows," Clara confirmed. "Constance, why would you do something like that? What I said about William, none of it was true, and you knew that when you wrote it." "I know," Constance said, her voice breaking. "I know it was wrong. I have known it was wrong since the moment I sealed the envelope, but I did not know what else to do." "What do you mean?" Constance was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her twisting hands, before finally lifting her gaze to meet her sister's. "There is something I have not told anyone, Clara. Not father, not mother, not you. I have been keeping it hidden for months, and I fear it can no longer stay that way." Clara leaned forward, her earlier anger softening slightly at the raw desperation in her sister's voice. "Tell me." "Last spring, before our family's troubles became public knowledge, I borrowed money," Constance admitted. "A significant sum from a man in the city who lends to families of standing, on the promise of future repayment. I used it for gowns, for jewelry, for the kind of appearance I believed I needed to secure a good marriage before our situation grew any worse. I told myself I would repay it easily once I married well, that it was simply an investment in my own future, and by extension, the future of our entire family." Clara's stomach sank as she began to understand the shape of what her sister was confessing. "How much did you borrow?" Constance named a sum that made Clara's breath catch in her throat, an amount that, added to the family's existing debts, would have been utterly impossible to repay through any ordinary means. "The man who lent it to me is not patient," Constance continued, her voice trembling. "He has sent someone to collect on multiple occasions over the past weeks, each time with less patience than the last. That voice you may have heard the other night. It was his associate, warning me that if the debt is not settled soon, he intends to speak with father directly, and to make the nature of the loan, and the reasons behind it, quite public." "And you thought marrying Lord Hartwell would solve this," Clara said slowly, pieces falling into place. "You needed his wealth not simply for ambition, but to settle a debt you were too afraid to admit even existed." Constance nodded miserably. "When you refused him, when it seemed as though he might choose you instead, I panicked. I could not bear the thought of losing my only chance at solving this before it destroyed what little reputation our family has left. I know what I did was wrong, Clara. I have known it since the moment I did it. But I was desperate, and desperate people do not always make wise choices." Clara sat back in her chair, processing the weight of everything her sister had just revealed. Her initial fury at the fabricated letter remained, sharp and unresolved, but it now existed alongside a reluctant, complicated sympathy for the fear that had driven her sister to such lengths. "Why are you telling me this now?" Clara asked. "Because the man's associate came to see me again last night, after you likely overheard us," Constance said. "He gave me one final week to produce the funds, or he intends to visit our father directly." "I do not know what to do, Clara. I have exhausted every option I can think of, and I am terrified of what will happen when father learns the truth." Clara studied her sister's face for a long moment, weighing the anger she still felt against the genuine desperation now laid bare before her. Whatever else Constance had done, whatever cruelty she had attempted in her letter, the fear driving her was real, and Clara could not entirely fault her sister for the panic that came with facing ruin alone, in secret, with no one to turn to for help. "You should have told father from the beginning," Clara said finally, "or mother. Keeping this hidden has only made everything worse." "I know that now," Constance admitted. "But I did not want them to see me as a failure, on top of everything else our family has already suffered. I wanted, just once, to be the daughter who solved a problem, rather than created one." Clara rose from her chair and walked to the window, looking out over the frost-covered gardens where, only days earlier, she had stood speaking with Reginald about honesty and performance, and the value of simply being oneself. She thought of his promise to settle her family's debts regardless of her decision, and wondered, with a flicker of hope she was almost afraid to acknowledge, whether that promise might extend far enough to cover this new and unexpected crisis as well. "I will speak with Lord Hartwell," Clara said finally, turning back to face her sister. "I cannot promise he will agree to help you, especially after what you attempted against me, but I will explain the full situation and let him decide for himself." Constance's eyes filled with fresh tears, this time from gratitude rather than fear. "You would do that for me? After everything I did?" "I am doing it because you are my sister," Clara said simply, "and because I understand, better than perhaps anyone else in this house, what it feels like to be cornered into a decision you never wanted to make in the first place." The two sisters sat together in silence for a while after that, an unfamiliar closeness settling between them, fragile and new, built on the wreckage of betrayal and fear, rather than any easy affection. It was not forgiveness, not entirely, not yet. But it was, perhaps, the beginning of something that had been missing between them for a very long time. When Reginald arrived later that day, Clara wasted no time in explaining the full situation, watching his expression carefully as she recounted her sister's confession. He listened without interruption, his features unreadable, until she had finished speaking. "Your sister attempted to damage your reputation through outright falsehood," he said finally, "and now you are asking me to help settle a debt she incurred through her own reckless choices." "I am not asking you to forgive what she did," Clara clarified. "I am asking you to consider helping her regardless, not for her sake alone, but because the consequences of that debt going unpaid would fall on my entire family, myself included, and my father has already suffered enough." Reginald was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "You have a remarkable capacity for compassion, Miss Wentworth, even toward those who have wronged you directly." "I do not know if it is compassion," Clara admitted. "Perhaps it is simply practicality. Anger alone will not solve this problem. Only action will." A faint smile touched the corner of Reginald's mouth, brief but genuine. "Very well. I will look into the matter and settle it discreetly, on one condition." "What condition?" "That your sister understands clearly this generosity is extended for your sake, not her own, and that she owes you a debt far greater than any sum of money could repay." Clara nodded slowly, a weight lifting from her chest that she had not fully realized she was carrying. "I will make certain she understands." As Reginald turned to leave, he paused at the edge of the garden, looking back at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something softer, less guarded than his usual careful composure. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Wentworth," he said. "Every time I believe I have begun to understand the shape of your character, you reveal another layer entirely. I find myself increasingly reluctant to stop learning what lies beneath." Clara felt her cheeks warm, uncertain how to respond to words that carried far more weight than their simple phrasing suggested. She said nothing, only watched as he climbed into his carriage and disappeared down the long gravel drive, leaving her alone in the garden with her thoughts, and with the growing, undeniable realization that whatever she had once believed about this arrangement, about this man, was shifting into something far more complicated than she had ever anticipated. In the days that followed, something in the rhythm of the household began, slowly, to change. Constance's debt was settled quietly, exactly as Reginald had promised, and though the two sisters did not become close in the way storybooks might describe, a fragile truce settled between them, built on shared secrets and a debt of gratitude that neither of them spoke of openly. Constance began joining the family for meals again, with something closer to genuine warmth, and once, late one evening, she even sought Clara out simply to thank her again, quietly, without an audience to witness the moment. Clara found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, looking forward to Reginald's visits. He came every few days, always with the same careful patience, never pressing her for more than she was willing to give, content simply to walk with her through the winter gardens, or sit with her near the fire in the small sitting room, discussing everything and nothing at once. He asked about the horses, genuinely curious rather than merely polite, and listened with real attention as she explained the careful process of nursing Whisper back to health, the patience required, the small victories that meant more to her than any grand social triumph ever could. In turn, she learned things about him that surprised her. She learned that his father, for all his wealth, had been a distant and demanding man, more interested in the family's business ventures than in his only son, and that Reginald had spent much of his childhood essentially alone, raised more by tutors and servants than by any warm parental presence. She learned that he had built much of his current fortune not through inheritance alone, but through his own careful decisions in the years since his father's passing, decisions that had required him to develop the same kind of quiet, watchful patience she had noticed in him from their very first conversation. "I did not expect to enjoy this," Clara admitted one afternoon, as they walked slowly along the frost-covered garden path, her breath visible in the cold air. "Any of it. I came into this arrangement expecting a stranger, interested only in acquiring a wife, the way one acquires property. And now?" Reginald asked, watching her carefully. "Now I find myself confused," Clara admitted honestly. "I still do not fully trust the circumstances that brought us together. I do not know if I can separate the man from the arrangement that created him. In my mind, as a person I am meant to consider marrying." Reginald nodded slowly, seeming to consider her words with genuine thought rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "May I ask you something personal, Miss Wentworth? Something I have wondered since our very first conversation in this garden." "You may ask," Clara said. "I cannot promise I will answer. Your refusal, that first day, it carried a weight beyond simple objection to the manner in which the arrangement was proposed. There was something more personal in it, I think, something rooted in experience rather than principle alone." Clara was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much of the truth she was willing to share. She had not spoken of this to anyone outside her immediate family in years, had buried it beneath the daily rhythm of stable work and quiet routine, choosing to move forward rather than dwell on a wound that had never fully healed. "When I was 17, she finally said, "I was engaged to a young man from a family my father hoped to align ourselves with. His name was Edmund Cole, and for a brief time, I believed myself genuinely fortunate. He seemed kind, attentive, everything a young woman might hope for, in a match arranged largely for practical reasons rather than affection." "What happened?" Reginald asked gently. "6 months into our engagement, I discovered he had been courting another young woman in secret, someone from a wealthier family than my own, someone who could offer him a far more advantageous connection than I could. When her family's fortune became public knowledge, he broke our engagement without a word of explanation, simply announced it through a letter delivered by his solicitor, as though I were a business arrangement that had failed to meet expectations, rather than a person he had once claimed to care for." Reginald's expression darkened slightly, though he said nothing, allowing her to continue at her own pace. "After that, I decided I would never again allow myself to be treated as a transaction," Clara continued. "I threw myself into the work of the stables instead, into something honest and tangible, where the value of my effort was never in question, where a horse did not care about my family's fortune or my father's connections, only about the quality of care I provided. When your offer came, when I heard how it had been proposed, I saw in it every echo of what happened with Edmund, dressed up in slightly different clothing." "I am sorry," Reginald said quietly, "not simply for what happened to you, though I am sorry for that as well, but for the way my own offer must have reopened a wound you had worked so hard to close." "You did not know," Clara said. "You could not have known." "No," Reginald agreed, "but knowing it now, I understand far better why your refusal carried such conviction that first day. It was not simply objection to an unusual arrangement, it was self-preservation, built from genuine experience." Clara looked at him then, really looked at him, searching his face for any hint of the calculating detachment she had once assumed defined him entirely. She found instead something that looked remarkably like understanding, and beneath it, something warmer still, something she was not yet ready to name. "I do not know what I want anymore," she admitted quietly. "I came into this arrangement so certain of my refusal. and now I find that certainty has grown far less solid than it once was. You do not need to know today, Reginald said. I told you before. I am a patient man. I will not rush you toward a decision simply because circumstances might make it convenient for me to do so. They walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, the weight of her confession settling between them not as a burden, but as something shared, something that had drawn them, however slightly, closer together than they had been before. Neither of them noticed William, standing near the edge of the stable yard, watching the two of them walk together through the winter garden, with an expression of quiet, private heartbreak that he made no attempt to hide, simply because there was no one present to witness it. He had told himself, over the past several days, that his feelings for Clara were something he could set aside, something that had always existed more as a quiet, unspoken hope than any real expectation. He had known, even as he spoke his admission to her in the stable that cold morning, that a man in his position had little chance against a nobleman of Reginald's standing. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it settle permanently into his chest were two very different experiences, and watching Clara laugh softly at something Reginald had said, watching the easy comfort that had grown between them over the past days, William felt the last fragile threads of his hope begin to unravel entirely. He turned away before either of them could notice him watching, retreating back into the stables, where the horses, at least, offered no judgment and required no explanation for the tightness in his chest or the sudden, unwelcome sting behind his eyes. That evening, as Clara made her way back to the stables for her usual final check on the horses before retiring for the night, she found William already there, brushing down one of the carriage horses with more force than the task strictly required, his movements sharp and agitated in a way that immediately caught her attention. "Is something wrong?" she asked, approaching carefully. "No," William said, not looking up from his work. "Nothing is wrong. William, I have known you long enough to recognize when you are lying to me." He paused, his hand resting against the horse's flank, his shoulders tense. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, and Clara began to wonder if he intended to answer her at all. "I saw you," he finally said, his voice quiet and careful, stripped of its usual warmth. "In the garden, with him. You looked happy, Clara, truly happy, in a way I do not believe I have ever managed to make you look, in all the years we have known one another." Clara's chest tightened at the raw vulnerability in his words. "William, You do not need to explain yourself to me," he interrupted gently. "You owe me nothing, Clara. I understand that. I have always understood that, even when I allowed myself to hope otherwise. I only ask that you be honest with yourself about what you are choosing, and why, before you commit to a path you cannot easily walk back from." Clara stood in silence, uncertain how to respond to the quiet ache in his voice, the careful restraint of a man determined not to burden her with feelings she had never explicitly invited. She thought of Reginald's patience, of Edmund's betrayal so many years ago, of William's steady, unwavering presence throughout her entire life, and found herself, for the first time in weeks, genuinely uncertain of anything at all. The storm arrived without warning, the way the worst ones often do, rolling in over the hills just after midnight, while the entire household slept soundly, unaware of the danger gathering in the darkness outside. Clara woke to the sound of thunder cracking so violently that her window rattled in its frame, and beneath the roar of the wind, she heard something else, something that sent her bolting upright in bed before she had even fully registered the sound: the frantic, terrified screaming of horses. She was out of bed and pulling on her boots before conscious thought had fully caught up with instinct, racing down the stairs and out into the storm without pausing to grab a coat against the driving rain. Lightning split the sky as she ran across the grounds toward the stables, illuminating, for one terrible instant, the flickering orange glow of flame visible through the stable's far windows. Fire. No, Clara gasped, pushing herself faster through the mud and rain, her heart pounding with a terror sharper than anything she had felt in years. No, no, no. By the time she reached the stable doors, smoke was already curling out from beneath them, thick and acrid, and the screaming of the horses inside had grown desperate, a sound that tore straight through her chest. She threw the doors open without hesitation, coughing immediately, as smoke rolled out to meet her. The far corner of the stable, already engulfed in flame, likely started by a lantern knocked loose in the storm's fierce wind. "William!" she screamed, though she could not be certain he would hear her over the roar of the fire and the storm combined. She pulled her shawl up over her mouth and nose and pushed forward into the smoke-filled stable, moving toward Whisper's stall first, the old mare's frightened whinnying cutting through the chaos. The horse reared in panic as Clara approached, eyes wide and rolling with terror, and for a moment, Clara feared she would not be able to calm the animal enough to lead her safely out. She forced her own racing heart to slow, drawing on years of patient practice, speaking in a low, steady voice, even as smoke stung her eyes and throat. "Easy, girl. Easy. I have you. I am not leaving you here." She managed to loop a lead rope around Whisper's halter and began pulling the frightened animal toward the door, coughing hard against the smoke thickening rapidly around them. Behind her, she heard other horses screaming, still trapped in their stalls, and she knew, with a sick certainty, that she could not save them all alone. "Clara!" William's voice cut through the chaos, and a moment later he appeared through the smoke, soaked through from the rain, his face streaked with soot from where he had clearly already been working to free other horses before finding her. "The far stalls are clear, but there are still 3 horses trapped near the fire. We need to move fast." "Get Whisper outside," Clara said, thrusting the lead rope into his hands. "I will go back for the others." "Clara, no. It is too dangerous. The fire is spreading." "I am not leaving them in there to die," she shouted, over the roar of the flames, already turning back toward the smoke-filled interior, before he could argue further. She had made it barely 3 steps back into the stable, when a third figure burst through the doors behind her, soaked and breathless, having clearly ridden through the storm at reckless speed the moment word had somehow reached him of the danger. Reginald did not pause to ask questions or offer explanations. He simply pulled his own coat up over his mouth and moved directly toward the nearest trapped horse, working the stall latch loose with hands that shook slightly. Whether from cold or urgency, Clara could not tell. "You should not be here," Clara gasped, coughing against the thickening smoke as she reached the next stall over. "Neither should you," Reginald shot back, wrestling the panicked horse free of its stall and guiding it firmly toward the exit. "But here we both are." Together, they worked through the chaos, moving from stall to stall, coaxing terrified animals free with whatever combination of firm command and gentle reassurance each particular horse required. The heat grew more intense with every passing minute, the fire spreading faster than Clara had anticipated, licking hungrily along the dry wooden beams overhead. Smoke filled her lungs, until every breath felt like swallowing fire itself, and still, she pressed forward, refusing to leave any animal behind if there was any possible way to save it. They had freed all but one horse, a young gelding named Storm who had grown so terrified he had wedged himself into the back corner of his stall, refusing to move despite Reginald's best efforts to guide him toward the door, when a sharp cracking sound echoed from overhead, followed immediately by a section of burning roof beam, collapsing down into the aisle just behind them, sending a fresh wave of sparks and smoke billowing through the enclosed space. "Clara, we need to leave now," Reginald said urgently, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "The roof is not going to hold much longer." "I am not leaving him," Clara said, pushing forward toward the terrified horse despite the growing danger, coughing violently as the smoke thickened further around them. Reginald hesitated only a fraction of a second before following her, and together they finally managed to coax the terrified gelding free, Reginald taking firm hold of the lead while Clara guided the animal from behind, pushing him forward through the smoke toward the faint outline of the stable doors still visible ahead of them. They burst out into the storm just as another section of the roof collapsed behind them with a deafening crash, sending a fresh plume of sparks and smoke shooting upward into the rain-soaked night sky. Clara stumbled forward, coughing violently, her lungs burning, her legs finally giving out beneath her, as the adrenaline that had carried her through the crisis began to fade. Reginald caught her before she hit the ground, his arms wrapping around her firmly, steadying her weight against his own as she continued coughing, trying desperately to clear the smoke from her lungs. Around them, the rain continued falling in heavy sheets, and the horses they had rescued stood scattered across the wet grounds, frightened but alive, William already moving among them, checking each animal carefully for injury. "You are all right," Reginald said, his voice low and urgent near her ear, still holding her upright as her breathing gradually steadied. "You are all right, Clara. You are safe. It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal title attached, and something in the raw, unguarded worry threaded through his voice struck her more deeply than any of their previous careful, measured conversations ever had. She looked up at him, rain streaming down both their faces, smoke still curling from her hair, and found him watching her with an expression stripped of every ounce of careful composure he had maintained since the very first day they met. "You came," she said, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "In the middle of the storm. How did you even know?" "One of your household staff sent word the moment the fire was spotted from the main house," Reginald said. "I was still awake, working through correspondence. I did not think. I simply rode." "You could have been killed," Clara said, still struggling to steady her breathing, acutely aware of the warmth of his arms still supporting her weight, of how close they were standing in the driving rain. "So could you," Reginald said. "And yet neither of us hesitated for even a moment before running toward the danger rather than away from it." Clara let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though it caught somewhere between exhaustion and lingering fear. "I suppose that says something about both of us." "I suppose it does," Reginald agreed, and for a long moment, neither of them moved, standing together in the rain amid the wreckage of the burning stable, the rescued horses shifting nervously nearby, William watching them both from a short distance away, with an expression that had finally, quietly, settled into something like resigned understanding. The fire was eventually brought under control by the household staff and several neighboring workers who arrived to help once word of the blaze spread, though by morning, half the stable structure lay in charred, smoking ruin. Every horse had survived, a small miracle that Clara clung to gratefully amid the wreckage of everything else. She stood at dawn, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, watching the smoke still curling faintly from the collapsed roof, and felt, for the first time since Reginald Hartwell had first walked into her family's drawing room, a complete and undeniable certainty settle into her chest. She was no longer simply confused about her feelings toward him. She understood them perfectly now, whether she was ready to admit it aloud or not. In the days following the fire, Reginald insisted on funding the complete rebuilding of the stable, refusing every attempt Edgar made to decline the offer or negotiate a smaller contribution. Workers arrived within the week, and construction began almost immediately on a new structure, larger and sturdier than the original, with proper stone foundations that would prevent any future blaze from spreading as quickly as the last one had. Clara found herself spending long hours overseeing the construction, alongside William, both of them determined to ensure the new stable would serve the horses well for generations to come. Their friendship, though it had weathered the strange tension of recent weeks, settled back into something comfortable and familiar, though a quiet distance remained between them now, an unspoken acknowledgement of feelings that would not be pursued further, on either side. "You made your choice clear that night," William said to her one afternoon, as they watched workers raise the first of the new stable's timber frames against the pale winter sky. "Even before you said a word about it." "What do you mean?" Clara asked. "You ran into a burning building without hesitation to save those horses," William said. "And when he arrived, when he ran in after you without a second thought either, I understood something I had perhaps been avoiding understanding for quite some time. Men do not risk their lives that recklessly for arrangements they do not care about, Clara, and neither do you." Clara did not answer immediately, watching the workers continue their careful, methodical progress. "I am sorry, William. I never meant to cause you pain." "You did not cause it," William said gently. "Hope did that on its own, long before you ever had a choice in the matter. I do not regret it, though. I would rather have hoped and been wrong than never allowed myself to feel anything at all." He offered her a small, genuine smile, tinged with sadness, but free of resentment. "I only want you to be happy, Clara, whatever shape that happiness takes." She reached out and squeezed his hand briefly, grateful beyond words for the steady, generous kindness of his friendship, even now, even as it settled into something different than either of them had once imagined it might become. It was 2 weeks later, on a bright but bitterly cold morning, that the final complication arrived, one Clara had never anticipated, and certainly never wished to face. She was in the garden, waiting for Reginald's usual afternoon visit, when a carriage she did not recognize pulled up the long drive, considerably less grand than Reginald's own, though clearly belonging to someone of reasonable means. Clara watched with mild curiosity as a young man stepped down from it, straightening his coat with a familiar, practiced gesture that sent an unpleasant jolt of recognition through her, before he had even turned to face the house fully. Edmund Cole. She had not seen him in nearly 4 years, not since the humiliating letter that had ended their engagement so abruptly, and the sight of him now, standing in her family's drive as though he had every right to be there, filled her with a complicated tangle of anger and old, half-buried hurt. "Clara," he said, spotting her near the garden gate and approaching with a smile that struck her as far too easy, far too confident, for a man who had once discarded her so carelessly. "You look well. Truly, I had heard rumors of your family's difficulties, but you appear to be thriving despite them." "What are you doing here, Edmund?" Clara asked, her voice cold, offering no pretense of the polite hospitality he clearly expected. "I heard news of your engagement prospects," Edmund said, undeterred by her tone. "Lord Hartwell, is it? A remarkable match, Clara, truly. I confess I was surprised to hear it, given our own history, but I suppose circumstances change." "Say what you came to say," Clara said, crossing her arms tightly against the cold, and against the discomfort of standing so close to a man who represented everything she had spent years trying to move beyond. Edmund's smile faltered slightly, replaced by something more calculated. "I came, if I am honest, to offer you a chance to reconsider our own arrangement. My circumstances have changed considerably since we last spoke. The marriage I pursued instead of you did not, in the end, provide the advantages I had anticipated, and I find myself, once again, in need of a suitable match. I thought, given our history, you thought I might consider marrying you," Clara interrupted, disbelief coloring her voice. "After you abandoned our engagement without so much as a word of explanation, the moment a wealthier prospect presented itself." "I was young," Edmund said, though the excuse sounded weak even to his own ears, judging by the way his confidence wavered slightly under her sharp gaze. "I made a mistake, Clara. I am prepared to admit that now. And I believe, given the current attention Lord Hartwell has shown you, that you understand better than most how quickly circumstances and fortunes can shift. Perhaps it would be wise to keep your options open, rather than commit yourself entirely to a man who may yet change his mind, just as easily as I once did." The insinuation, thinly veiled beneath his careful phrasing, landed exactly where he intended it to, striking at the old wound of abandonment she had carried for years. For a brief, unsettling moment, doubt flickered through her, old fears rising unbidden at the reminder that promises, even sincere-sounding ones, could still be broken. But then she thought of Reginald running into a burning stable without hesitation. She thought of his patient, careful honesty across weeks of quiet conversation, his willingness to settle her family's debts without condition, his genuine curiosity about her life, her work, her thoughts, never once treating her as a transaction, despite the circumstances that had first brought them together. Whatever fear Edmund's words had briefly stirred settled quickly, replaced by a clarity she had not expected to feel so completely in this moment. "You are wrong, Edmund," Clara said, her voice steady now, free of the earlier tremor of old hurt. "I do understand how quickly circumstances can shift. I learned that lesson from you, 4 years ago, and I have carried it carefully ever since. But that lesson does not apply here, because Lord Hartwell has already proven, time and again, exactly the kind of man he is, not through words alone, but through actions I have witnessed directly. You, on the other hand, have proven exactly the kind of man you are as well, standing here now, trying to reclaim something you discarded the moment it stopped serving your ambitions." Edmund's expression hardened, his earlier charm evaporating entirely. "You are making a mistake, Clara. Men like Hartwell do not remain devoted forever. When the novelty of your unconventional charm wears thin, you will find yourself alone, and by then, opportunities like the one I am offering you today may no longer exist." "Then I will take that risk," Clara said firmly. "Because whatever happens, I would rather face an uncertain future built on genuine trust than a certain one built on the kind of calculation you have just demonstrated so clearly. Please leave, Edmund. There is nothing here for you." Edmund studied her for a long moment, perhaps searching for some crack in her resolve, some lingering hope he could exploit. Finding none, he finally turned, climbing back into his carriage, with visibly wounded pride, muttering something under his breath that Clara did not bother trying to hear. She stood alone in the garden for a long while after his carriage disappeared down the drive, her heart still pounding from the confrontation. But beneath the lingering adrenaline, she felt something else entirely. A quiet, settled certainty that had been building within her for weeks, finally crystallizing into complete, undeniable clarity. She knew, without any remaining doubt, exactly what she wanted, and exactly who she wanted it with. When Reginald arrived later that afternoon, unaware of the confrontation that had unfolded only hours earlier, he found Clara waiting for him at the garden gate, her expression carrying a determination he had not seen from her before. "Miss Wentworth," he greeted, offering his usual polite bow. "You seem different today." "I need to ask you something," Clara said, before he could say anything further, "and I need an honest answer." "Of course," Reginald said, his expression growing serious at the shift in her tone. "When you first proposed this arrangement to my father, was there any part of it, even the smallest part, that was about wanting a genuine connection, rather than simply ending a tiresome search for a suitable wife?" Reginald was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to everything he said to her. "I proposed the arrangement out of exhaustion, Miss Wentworth, exactly as I told you before. I did not expect to find anything genuine within it. But somewhere between that first afternoon and this one, standing here with you now, I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement entirely, and started thinking of it as something I hoped, quite desperately, might become real." Clara felt her heart swell with something that finally, fully, resembled certainty rather than confusion. "Good," she said, "because I believe I am ready to give you my answer." "I accept," Clara said, the words leaving her with a lightness she had not expected, as though a weight she had carried since the very first day of this entire arrangement had finally lifted from her shoulders. "Not because of the debts, and not because my father asked it of me. I accept because somewhere between the mud on my boots that first afternoon and the smoke in my lungs during the fire, I stopped seeing you as a stranger and started seeing you as someone I genuinely wished to build a life alongside." Reginald's composure, so carefully maintained through every previous conversation between them, finally broke entirely, a smile spreading across his face that transformed his usually guarded expression into something younger, more open than she had ever seen from him before. "You have no idea how long I have hoped to hear you say those words, Clara." "I think perhaps I do," Clara said softly, "given how patiently you have waited for them." He reached out and took her hand, gently, as though still half afraid this moment might prove to be some passing dream he would wake from disappointed. "I intend to spend the rest of my life proving to you that this choice was the right one, not through wealth or grand gestures, but through the same honesty that brought us here in the first place." They walked together back toward the house, hand in hand, and when they entered the drawing room where the family had gathered, drawn by some instinct that today's visit carried different weight than all those that had come before it, the news was met with an outpouring of emotion that filled the room entirely. Edgar wept openly, gripping his daughter's hands with a gratitude that went far beyond the relief of settled debts, a father's genuine joy at seeing his youngest daughter finally find happiness after years of quiet, unassuming sacrifice. Margaret embraced Clara tightly, whispering blessings and well wishes through her own tears. Harriet, emerging briefly from her studio with paint still faintly visible on her fingers, offered a warm, genuine smile and a promise to paint a portrait of the couple as a wedding gift. And Constance, standing slightly apart from the celebration at first, finally stepped forward, her expression carrying none of the earlier resentment that had once colored every interaction between the sisters. "I owe you an apology," Constance said quietly, once the initial excitement had settled enough for private conversation. "Not simply for the letter, though certainly for that as well, but for every unkind thought I harbored against you throughout this entire ordeal. You deserve this happiness, Clara, more than I ever gave you credit for deserving, if I am honest." "Thank you," Clara said, embracing her sister warmly. "I meant what I said before. We are family, Constance. Whatever mistakes either of us makes along the way, that will not change." Constance's eyes filled with fresh tears, and for the first time in longer than either sister could remember, their embrace carried genuine warmth rather than practiced obligation. Word of the engagement spread quickly through the county in the days that followed, carried by servants and neighbors alike, and though a few whispered rumors of Edmund Cole's earlier failed attempt to reclaim Clara's affections briefly circulated among the local gossips, they found little traction against the obvious, genuine happiness radiating from the newly engaged couple whenever they appeared together in public. Edmund himself, humiliated by his failed attempt and the swift spread of his own poor reputation among those who learned of it, quietly left the county altogether within a fortnight, seeking better prospects elsewhere. William, for his part, accepted the news of the engagement with quiet grace, offering his sincere congratulations to Clara without a trace of the earlier bitterness that had briefly strained their friendship. He continued working at the stables through the wedding preparations, and Clara made certain, in the midst of all the planning and excitement, that he understood how much his steady friendship had meant to her throughout every difficult moment of the past months, regardless of how their relationship had ultimately settled. "You will always have a place here," she told him one afternoon, as they worked together preparing the new stable for its first proper spring season. "Whatever happens, whatever changes, that will never be in question." "I know," William said, and this time, his smile carried no lingering sadness, only genuine warmth. "You have always been the kind of person who takes care of what matters to her, Clara. I have simply been fortunate enough to witness it firsthand for most of my life." The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparation, though Clara insisted, gently but firmly, on a celebration that reflected who she genuinely was, rather than the grand, elaborate spectacle that Constance might once have envisioned for such an occasion. Reginald, to her quiet relief, agreed entirely, expressing no interest in a display of wealth for its own sake, preferring instead a celebration rooted in the same honest simplicity that had defined their relationship from its most difficult beginning to its unexpectedly joyful present. The new stable, finally completed just weeks before the ceremony, stood as a quiet testament to everything that had changed since that first, tense afternoon when Reginald Hartwell had arrived unannounced at the Wentworth estate, with an offer that had seemed, at the time, so coldly transactional. Whisper, fully recovered from her earlier illness and the trauma of the fire, grazed contentedly in the new paddock alongside the other horses, entirely unaware of the role she had inadvertently played in bringing two people together who might otherwise have remained strangers forever. On the evening before the wedding, Clara found herself once more in the stable, standing beside Whisper in the quiet darkness, drawing the same comfort from the old mare's steady presence that she always had, even now, on the threshold of a life so different from anything she had once imagined for herself. "I never thought this is where I would end up," she admitted softly to the horse, who nuzzled gently against her shoulder in response. "But I am glad, Whisper, truly glad, in a way I did not know I was capable of feeling, back when all of this began." She thought of that first chaotic afternoon, running late from the stables, mud on her boots and dirt on her cheek, stumbling into a room full of strangers, deciding her future without her consent. She thought of her sharp, immediate refusal, the anger and fear that had driven it, and the long, careful path that had led her, step by uncertain step, from that moment to this one. Tomorrow, she would become Reginald Hartwell's wife, not because her father had chosen it for her, not because debt or desperation had forced her hand, but because she herself, given the freedom to choose, had chosen him, fully and completely, on her own terms. It was, she realized, standing quietly in the darkened stable on the eve of her wedding, exactly the kind of ending she had once believed impossible for someone in her circumstances, one built entirely on honesty, patience, and a choice made freely, rather than one forced by fortune or fear. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and bright, the last traces of winter frost finally giving way to the first gentle warmth of early spring, as though the season itself had chosen to mark the occasion with its own quiet celebration. Clara woke before dawn, exactly as she always had, though today, instead of pulling on her worn boots and heading straight for the stables, she found her mother already waiting in her room, along with Constance and Harriet, all three of them eager to help prepare her for the day ahead. "I still remember the first time you came running into that drawing room," Margaret said, gently working a delicate string of pearls into Clara's carefully arranged hair. "Covered in mud, completely unprepared, absolutely certain you wanted nothing to do with any of it." "I remember it too," Clara said, smiling at the memory that had once filled her with such dread, now recalled with nothing but warm amusement. "I was so angry that day. I could not imagine a version of this moment where I would be grateful for how it all began." "Life has a way of surprising us," Margaret said softly, "when we least expect it, and often when we most need it." Constance, standing nearby with a small collection of fresh flowers gathered from the estate's early spring garden, stepped forward, to weave a few delicate blossoms among the pearls in her sister's hair. "You look beautiful, Clara, truly. I do not think I have ever seen you look so at peace." "Thank you," Clara said, reaching out to squeeze her sister's hand. "For everything, for being here today, and for everything that came before it." Harriet, quieter than her sisters but no less present in her support, offered a small, wrapped canvas she had been working on secretly for weeks. A delicate painting capturing the new stable bathed in soft morning light, Whisper visible grazing peacefully near the paddock fence. "For your new home," Harriet said simply, "so you always remember where this all truly began." Clara held the painting close, blinking back tears that threatened to disrupt the careful work her mother had just finished on her hair. "It is perfect, Harriet. Thank you." Downstairs, Edgar waited near the front entrance, dressed in his finest coat, looking more like the man Clara remembered from her earliest childhood than the exhausted, defeated figure who had once stood trembling before a stack of unpaid debts in his study. When Clara descended the stairs, and he caught his first glimpse of her, fully dressed for her wedding day, his eyes filled with tears he made no attempt to hide. "You look exactly like your mother did on our own wedding day," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am so proud of you, Clara, not simply for the choice you have made today, but for everything that led you here. You never once compromised who you were, not even when the entire weight of this family's survival seemed to rest on your shoulders. That took more courage than I think you fully understand. I learned courage from watching you fight for this family, even when everything seemed lost," Clara said, embracing her father tightly. "Whatever strength I found it because you never stopped trying, even in the darkest moments." The ceremony itself was held in the gardens of the Wentworth estate, simple and intimate, exactly as Clara had requested, surrounded by close family, and the handful of staff who had become like extended family over the years, including William, who stood near the back of the small gathering, watching with genuine warmth as Clara walked down the flower-lined path toward where Reginald waited beneath an arch of early spring blossoms. Reginald, watching her approach, wore an expression Clara had never seen from him before, every careful, guarded composure completely stripped away, replaced by open, unguarded joy that made her own heart swell with a happiness she had once believed entirely impossible for someone in her circumstances. "You are certain," he whispered, as she reached him, an echo of the very first serious conversation they had shared in this same garden, months earlier. "This is truly what you want." "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," Clara whispered back, and the smile that spread across Reginald's face in response was answer enough for everyone watching. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, filled with words that spoke of honesty, of patience, of a choice freely made, rather than one forced by circumstance or fear. When Reginald finally slipped a simple, elegant ring onto Clara's finger, declaring his vows in a voice steady with genuine conviction, the small gathered crowd erupted into warm, joyful applause, none louder than Edgar's own, his earlier tears now mixed freely with laughter and pride. The celebration that followed carried on late into the afternoon, filled with music and laughter, and the kind of genuine warmth that no amount of wealth could have purchased on its own. Clara danced with her father, with William, whose earlier heartbreak had settled fully into genuine friendship and happiness for her, and finally, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, with her husband, surrounded by the gardens where their unlikely story had first begun to unfold. "Do you remember what you told me, that very first day in this garden?" Clara asked, resting her head against Reginald's shoulder as they moved slowly to the music. "I remember most of what you have ever said to me," Reginald said, a warm smile touching his lips. "Which particular moment do you mean?" "You said you were tired of performances, tired of a world where everyone showed you only what they believed you wanted to see," Clara said. "I did not fully understand then how deeply that loneliness must have shaped you. I understand it far better now. And you," Reginald said softly, "showed me, from the very first moment we met, muddy boots and all, exactly who you were, without hesitation or apology. I do not believe I have ever been more grateful for anything in my entire life." Later that evening, as the celebration finally began to wind down and the last of the guests departed into the gentle spring dusk, Clara slipped away briefly to visit the stables one final time before beginning her new life at Reginald's estate. Whisper greeted her with a soft, familiar nicker, and Clara pressed her forehead gently against the mare's neck exactly as she had done so many times before, though this time, the gesture carried the weight of farewell rather than simple daily routine. "I will visit often," Clara whispered to the old horse. "This will always be part of my home, no matter where else I might live." Reginald appeared quietly in the stable doorway, watching the tender moment with a soft, understanding smile. "I have already arranged for Whisper, and any other horses you wish, to be moved to our own stables whenever you are ready. I did not think it right to ask you to leave behind everything that matters to you, simply because our address has changed." Clara turned to him, her heart full to the point of overflowing, and crossed the stable to embrace him fully, grateful beyond words for a man who had, from their very first honest conversation in this garden, understood exactly what mattered most to her, and had never once asked her to sacrifice it for the sake of their union. "Thank you," she said softly, "for choosing honesty, even when it would have been easier not to." "Thank you," Reginald replied, "for walking into that room late, covered in mud, exactly as you were, without a single moment of pretense. I do not believe I will ever stop being grateful that you did." Outside, the last light of the spring evening settled gently over the Wentworth estate, illuminating the new stable standing strong where the old one had once burned, the gardens where two strangers had slowly, carefully, become something far more meaningful than either of them had dared to imagine at the very beginning. Inside the main house, Edgar and Margaret sat together by the fire, their debts settled, their daughters finally at peace, the desperate uncertainty of the winter months, now nothing more than a difficult memory, softened by the warmth of everything that had followed. And somewhere between the mud-stained arrival that had begun this entire story, and the quiet, genuine happiness that now marked its ending, Clara Wentworth, now Clara Hartwell, had discovered something she had once believed entirely lost to her, that a choice made freely, built on honesty rather than obligation, could grow into something far more lasting and true than any arrangement built on wealth or desperation alone. It was, in the end, exactly the kind of story neither of them had expected to find themselves living, and exactly the kind of story both of them were profoundly grateful to have found.